Hey guys, welcome back to the Ruler School Yearbook with yours truly, Paul Reisman. Today we are going to be continuing our top 20 series as we look into the top 20 win cards, all the way from Grim Cluster through Saga Cluster. Of course, we're not talking about Dual Cluster yet because as of the filming of this video, we do not have all of Dual Cluster yet. Although we did just get the third and final set of that cluster announced today, which is great. But we're going to be looking at the best cards for all the clusters that have finished up through this so far. That being said, we're also filming this post ban list, which is going to relieve spinning myths of the ban list. Now, this is not on the list, but I just thought I would mention it. This card originally did not make the list, and I don't know how good it is because we don't have a lot of myths in the game outside of something like Izanagi for the moment. But I just thought I would make this a unofficial honorable mention because this card actually potentially has some playability in the format. That being said, I have 20 other cards that I think you should be picking up, and including this one, so consider this a bonus card if you want to pick this up. There are some myths in the game that are actually pretty powerful, like I mentioned, Izanagi, so maybe this card is something you want to pick up right now. Do it. I don't see why not. This card is always just going to be good to have in your repertoire. It ramps you a stone if you torrent it, so it's pretty darn decent. That being said, number 20 on this list is Wind-Secluded Refuge. This is one of those cards that, just keep it in the back of your mind with Wind because it is a really good way of getting around effects that you cannot chase to. Now, when this card enters the field, it is for green and 1, and it's an addition, which has, over time improved the quality of this card because it is an addition. If you put this card into the field, it cantrips, so it replaces itself, but then if an effect would target a resonator that you control, this is an optional continuous effect, which means that you can remove it from the field and prevent that effect from going off and basically cancel the effect. This is one of the quintessential ways that you get around something like Flame of the Outer World, which says, target resonator, J resonator takes 800 damage. Players cannot chase to this card. This is not chasing the card. This is basically just a replacement or a continuous effect that says we're going to prevent you from targeting that. So this is a really good way of getting around effects like that. And there's not a ton of those effects in the game. So this is one of those cards where if you have the ability to pick it up, it's one of those just really solid ways of protecting your stuff once it comes out. So for that reason, it's number 20 on this list. Next up, we have Final Forfeit. So we have a card like this in red called Gradius, which blinks the effect of an opponent's J resonator and deals them 800 damage, which is really, really solid, as long as they don't have barrier, right? Final Forfeit is the original version of that card. Final Forfeit is a 1 green, so it's just a 1-cost green chant that says your opponent's J/resonator loses abilities at the end of the turn. The original blank, as you will. It's still really useful because it is in green, and some decks are going to be wanting to play green because green is one of the best colors in the entire game, if not the best color in the entire game. So Final Forfeit is going to be able to slot into those. Of course, this is one card of many that can actually blank effects, but it is something you want to keep your mind toward because this is just a really good high utility green card in the Wanderer format. Next up, we have Destruction of the Portal. This is one of the best addition removal cards in green. It has Remnant, so even though it's also Quick Cast, which I can't say this enough. Quick Cast is one of the best keywords in the entire game. It is a green 1, so it's a 2-cost green spell. Quick Cast and Remnant, destroy target addition. This might have applications, especially going forward. We're seeing the fact that additions are getting stronger and stronger and stronger. So this card might actually go up in playability and value and utility. So this is one of those cards that I always think about when I think of green. What do I need to get rid of additions if they're going to be problematic? This is one of those go-to cards. So Destruction of the Portal, simple addition removal, but as additions gain in power, this card is just going to be really, really solid. Next up, we have Xeex, the Ancient Magic. Our first Ancient Magic card, even though we didn't get support for Ancient Magics until Lapis Cluster. It's very fascinating. This card is one of those great multimodal spells that makes the game of Force of Will so interesting. It can buff your field for +2/+2. It can shuffle your graveyard or your opponent's graveyard. It can stop a summon spell, which means it stops resonators, which is really interesting. And it costs 2 green, which means that it has applications. It's, for what it does, it lowers the cost and barrier to entry enough that it actually still I think can see some play. It does have a reprint for the Wanderer format, which is nice. So depending on what art you like, I personally like the original art just a bit more. It's got more of that like magical spellcaster vibe, which is kind of dope. But Xeex is just a really good multimodal green chant that you can play. It has quick cast as well, so it's got a lot of really good applications. It can cancel a resonator coming into the field. Play it. It's good. Next up, I skipped a card. Excuse me. Wow. Okay, well, now we're going to talk about Elixir's Love, okay? So before we even talk about Xeex, let's talk about Elixir's Love. I mentioned this in my blue video for the top 20 water cards. Spinning Aqua Soul is basically this card. Although this card is solid in the fact that it's in green. So if you need to reuse your cancels, this is a little bit more expensive, but you can use it again and again. And I believe it has a remnant, which I'm not entirely sure about as I look at it right now. But it's here. It has quick cast. It's solid. It's a really good card for recycling your chance. So Final Forfeit is up here. Xeex is up here, I believe. No, it's down here. Okay. Back on track. Next up, we have one of the best quick cast resonators in the game, and that is Viola, Treacherous Maiden. Again, this is one of those cards where it's not necessarily a battle trick, but it can be. It is a 6/6 quick cast resonator that when it enters the field, gives something +2/+2 and make it a dragon until end of the turn. And then you can banish this card from the field to remove 2 cards from your opponent's graveyard from the game. This is probably good in the sense that it is a quick cast resonator that can mess with your opponent's graveyard. The stats and the race change, they're relatively okay. We do have some things that are like anti-dragon in the format of Wanderer, so that's kind of relevant, but for the most part, you're playing this card if you want to mess with your opponent's graveyard and have ways to sort of block their stuff. This card is really solid for a lot of those reasons, which is why it is number 15 on this list. Of course, there were some decks that were completely used to playing quick cast resonators in green. Specifically, Scheherazade would play this card to mess with your opponent's graveyard on top of playing it on your opponent's turn, and for blocking or for just having like pseudo swiftness. So for all of those reasons, Viola is really, really solid. Next up, we have Morgiana, the Wise Servant. Now, this card is interesting in that it is draw support, oddly. Although in green, you're going to see draw support function a little bit differently than it does in blue, which is why they work so well together. I just bumped my desk, excuse me. They work so well together for this particular reason. Basically, Morgiana has a replacement effect that says if you would draw a card, look at the top 3 and pick one of those cards and put it into your hand, put the rest on the bottom of your deck in any order. So you're essentially seeing, instead of 1 card, you're seeing 3 cards. This card used to be amazing with Reflect Refrain. I don't know what else to say. Reflect Refrain basically said you get to look at the top card of your deck anytime and replace it. Morgiana basically said you get to look at 3 cards and replace the top card of your deck, which is really nice. Morgiana is... it's a combo card that is just looking to be broken again in the Wanderer format, in my opinion. Morgiana is fantastic. You can use it with Mooge Dart, the new Mooge Dart that came out in Saga Cluster in the Magic Stone War, to basically peek at the top 3 of your deck and put any card back on the bottom of your deck that you want, essentially replacing Reflect Refrain. So this card has some applications. Is it the end-all, be-all green card? No. It is there. It is powerful. That's why it's on the list in the first place, but there's a reason it's number 14. It could be stronger. So I think at this point in the game's history, it is relatively balanced. So unless you're looking for things specifically, this card is now at number 14. There are other cards that do what it does, but a little bit better. Next up, we have a very unique card in High Speed Dash. Now, High Speed Dash is the only card that we have in the game that allows you to basically reset your ruler and do judgment again. It also has an alternative mode, which says to put a card that your opponent controls back into their hand. So in that way, it functions very similarly to a blue card. But for the most part, this card is very, very interesting. If your opponent's trying to kill your J ruler, you can just put it back and do judgment again later. I personally use this in my OG Machina list to be able to reset if that effect of Machina to put stuff into the field is canceled. So this card has a lot of applications, especially with Regalia Rulers, excuse me, from Alice Origins cluster. You're able to sort of do the judgment, do the main effect, and then reset that card. I think specifically of Rezard with this card, because a lot of the times those Regalia Rulers are better on their front side than they are on their back side. So this card has got a lot of potential, and it also has... it does not work with Order Rulers very well, but for all the standard ruler/J ruler support, this card is really, really good for that particular reason. Next up, we have Calico Cat, the Shikigami. So green does like to mess with your graveyard a little bit. This is one of those cards. If you're looking for graveyard control for 1, this card is really good. And then when it dies, it replaces itself with a token. So it effectively doesn't die, but the stats are not amazing. The reason you're playing this card is because you are trying to mess with your opponent's graveyard a little bit and put stuff on the bottom of their deck. So Calico Cat is one of those cards that when people are building their decks, they still have this card in mind, which means it's a little bit higher on the priority list for some players than other cards on this list. So Calico Cat, very interesting. It does fix your will, which is not super relevant in a metagame where you have dual stones, but we did just lose 6-Age Stone in the Wanderer format. So this card might see a little bit more playability for that particular reason. But that being said, it's facilitating and disrupting a little bit, but it's not the most powerful card that we have in green. Next up, we have Table Flip. So Table Flip is a card that you can use with Hanzo. It's his master rune, his other master rune. And this card is powerful because it basically takes any damage and puts it onto your opponent instead. And it's doing this all for 1 cost if you use it with Hanzo. This card might see some more playability in the fact that it's just so interesting. It does some really interesting sort of deflection effects. And it does it all for 1 will. It's relatively low cost in Divinity, and it's really good for Hanzo, which is arguably the best rune ruler that we have in the game. So that's why Table Flip is so high up on this list. But now we're going to move into probably the best 1-drop that green has outside of the Mana Dorks and outside of Laurite and etc. Anyway, the basic starter for green is Tama. So Tama, familiar of Holy Wind, as well as the bird, the divine bird of Attoractia. These are your basic cantrip resonators. These are cards you would see a lot of the time in Fox because you would basically play them, have them replace themselves, and then because they're so cheap, you can basically turn them into giant chimeras, which is super fun. The bird has some playability over Tama in that it has natural flying. It also has resonance, if that's even relevant for you. If you just need to draw cards, it exists for that particular reason. And then Tama can manage itself to deal 200 to something on the field. These cards basically do the exact same thing with some minor stipulations as to how they could be used. I know that Fox decks in Lapis Cluster would tend to move more toward the Divine Bird, because Pricia, once it was released, it could get flying to things, so this thing was able to block those. And the ping effect from Tama wasn't super relevant, but Tama does have its applications too. If you're able to deal damage to something with Tama, there are cards that can take advantage of that and do some interesting things as well. So that being said, these cards are basically in the same basic place. They're in the smack dab middle of the list because they're basic staple 1-drops for green that get your plays started, that basically put something on board as a blocker, or basically just get your turns going on turn 1. So smack dab in the list, but we're going to move now into one of the better 1-cost cards in the game for green, and that is Bastet, Creator of Cats. This card is quick cast, enter, take a resonator you control and put it back into your hand. So if you have any resonator that would benefit from going back into your hand, if it's going to be destroyed, if it's going to be able to be used again because it has a strong enter effect, things like Viola potentially could be really good for that reason. There are other cards in this list that are also really good, like reusing your Laurites, reusing your Rachels, reusing your Welsers even. This card has a really good way of just sort of baiting out your opponent's destruction and putting those cards back in your hand. It has additional effects too, but for the most part, you're not going to be using those. You're mostly using this so you can reuse your other cards that are resonators on the field. So this card is a lot of utility, which is why it's higher up on the list at number 9. Next up, we have the only silence in green that is legal. If things will allow me to select. There we go. Okay, there we go. My computer froze for a second, but we're back. Final Breeze. Arguably one of those cards that you can trigger very easily. So basically it says put target spell back into your opponent's hand. That is addition, that is resonator, that is chant, right? So it takes it from the chase and puts it back into your opponent's hand. But if you torrent this card, your opponent can't play spells for the rest of the turn. In Wanderer format, that's super easy to do. We have so many good cards that you can just play super quick, especially during your upkeep, and then make all of your plays. And if your opponent tries to disrupt them, you basically just Final Breeze them and continue on with your plays. It's in green, which means it works really well with your mana dorks, your old mana dorks. It's basically Sumeria at this point for green. This card would not be on the list if Law of Silence were legal, but it is not. So this card is your next best option, and I think it's much more fair because you have to jump through a few more hoops to get Law of Silence, to get Final Breeze online as compared to Law of Silence. Anyway, that's number 8. Final Breeze is really solid. I use this card a lot, especially in green. If I'm running some sort of green package and I just want to be able to silence my opponent, punish them for making plays, this is one of those go-to cards that I have. Next up, we have Rachel, the Ancient Libraries Researcher. This card is nutty in that if it ever leaves the field, you draw a card. We have a ruler in the format that says if you have a tapped resonator, flicker it, which means that this card leaves the field, which means you get the tutor, which means you get to retrigger its enter effect, which is basically look at the top 3 of your deck or your opponent's and arrange them however you wish. Any cards you don't want on the top of the deck, they go into the graveyard instead. This card has a lot of interesting applications. It works really well with Command of Life and Death. It's a 7/7, which is not bad stat-wise. Although, we do have some cards that do -7 on the field at this point in the game's history. But this card is one of those cards, if you can combo with it, it is going to be nuts. It's going to disrupt your opponent's top decking. It's going to control basically what card your opponent draws. It can set up your own graveyard if you're somebody who really likes to be able to set up your own grave. This card has just a ton of applications. The mill effect, the search effect, all are very, very, very strong. And you can cheat it out with another card that's on this list. So that's why it's so high up. Next up, and I believe this is, we're going into, I'm going to do my counting here. I'm missing a card, it looks like, but that's okay. When my computer glitched, this happened. There we go. So next up, we have number 6, which is Elvish Priest and Sacred Elf. These are the first mana dorks that we had in the game of Force of Will, and they were in green, which was significantly more powerful than in any other color. That being said, this style of card has been more relegated to the white or light color attributes at this point. So these cards are really unique in that we are probably never going to see green get another mana dork like this ever again, at least for the foreseeable future. So these cards are your basic green support. If you saw my IML deck list for Wanderer format, you know that I played Sacred Elf and a couple of Elvish Priests, just because it does really help you to do things like play a Viola on your opponent's turn, or play Bastet, or play Final Breeze on your opponent's turn. It basically it gives you more mana to play with, which is always really good. It's always been that case in Magic. The Llanowar Elves mechanic has been super, super good in that game, and is basically bread and butter. So if you're playing green, you're probably playing it either for your cancels or for your mana dorks. Your cancels first, and your mana dorks second, which is why they're a little bit lower on the list, not in the top tier. That being said, we also have Stone Ramp in Trou. Now, Trou is, in my opinion, not as good anymore because Karlina has been banned. However, the idea of being able to tutor, spoilers, Laurite, which is definitely one of the better cards in green. Being able to like just tutor any 1-drop that you want out of the deck makes this card super good, because 1-drops are some of the most powerful cards in the game typically. This is going to be any Resonator that you want. Specifically, Laurite comes to mind, but there are other 1-drops too that are really good. Especially in this color, you have your Calico Cats, you have your Bastet, you have your Mana Dorks, but in other colors as well, you have really strong 1-drops as well. So that's why Trou is higher up on this list. Of course, if Karlina ever came off the ban list, this card would go up significantly in playability. Right now, we're not seeing how to play this card super well just now. But still, even though we don't have it, it's still pretty high up on this list because I just think it does so much good stuff. Next up, we have Welser and his last lecture. Welser is high up on this list right now because some of the most powerful decks in the format are the Six Sage Rulers. So we're looking at the Wanderer format, which means you don't get to play Feathsing, but we do get to play Almirius Mujdart, which can use a ton of different cards because of just how well they work together and sort of the plays they open up to play against other decks. Welser is basically your cancel spell for that deck, although it doesn't cancel anything. It actually just takes it and puts it back in your opponent's hand. That being said, I think there are other cancels in the game that are better than Welser, because Welser is basically saying you get to reuse that. If you use his last lecture part of it, your rulers will get additional stats later in the game, but then your body goes away. It just gets removed from the game. 2-cost Welser is basically stop that play, and I'm a body on the field, which is why Welser is so good. That being said, it can work really well with Final Breeze and some other cards in this. So he's a little bit higher up on the list, only because the rulers that he works with are so powerful right now and are probably going to be powerful going into the future. So Welser is high up on the list for that particular reason. But a cancel that is better than him is Faerur's Spell. Faerur's Spell stops Welser for 1. Faerur's Spell is a quick cast cancel spell for 1 that basically says if a spell has quick cast, it's canceled. My cat is trying to leave, but I'm going to cancel that with Faerur's Spell. No. Faerur's Spell is, in my opinion, definitely one of the best green cards ever printed. It came off the ban list a little while ago. Maybe it should go back on. I don't know. Faerur's Spell is really, really, really good. There are very few cancel spells that cost 1 in the game of Force of Will. And for some reason, this one is not banned, but it has been in the past. So if you're able to get a hold of this card, especially, this card is very, very strong. Next up, we have one of the most reprinted cards in all of Force of Will, and that is Laurite, the 7 Luminaries Astrologian. This card is also very nutty because it cancels any automatic effect and any activate effect. Period. Not of a Resonator. Any automatic effect. Any activate effect. Which means it can stop Ruler's effects too. This is why God's Arts are not super fun to play in Wanderer. Laurite just shuts them all down. And sure, he's a low cost, not very bulky card to play in general, but this card is shaping the metagame for the foreseeable future until it is also potentially banned. So Laurite and Faerur spell, highly recommend. Get playsets of these cards. You're going to need them in going into the future. They are basically staples of green, hands down. But definitely the best green card ever printed in the game of Force of Will that is not banned is Pricia, Seeker of Friends. Pricia's big show as well. So unless you have played against this card recently, you don't know what this card does. It's absolutely nuts. So you essentially play Pricia's big show, the bottom half first. It is a 1-cost green from hand for C2, which means you just pick at the top 2, and then you can put those cards on the bottom of your deck in any order, and then as this card resolves, you put it back in your hand. You basically get to look at the top 2 for no card economy whatsoever. For if you have green will, this is some of the best ways to sink that green will in upkeep. On the top half, which is a 2-cost quick cast 7/7, when it enters the field, for as many times as you played Big Show in the game, you can summon stuff from the deck that has that cost or lower. So one of the best ways to use this card is to essentially play Pricia, having Big Showed 3 times to find a Pricia in the deck, to play another Pricia from the deck, to play another Pricia from the deck, and to play your final card. This card in and of itself has defined the Feasting Mujdar card combination in New Frontiers ever since it came out. But in addition, it is one of the best enter effects ever printed in the game that doesn't cancel. It basically turns your whole deck into a toolbox, and I don't know how else to say. This card is just amazing. Being able to play it, being able to not only foresee and set up your hand, but then also just play whatever resonator you want from your deck, as long as you played Big Show enough that game. This card is just nutty. We used it in the recent IMO list alongside a few of these other green cards, like Final Breeze, like Rachel, Sacred Elf, Faerur Spell, and Laurite, to do some really interesting things. And basically, it makes sure that your draws are a little bit better. You're seeing cards that you want to see as opposed to cards you don't want to see. And then it basically is its own win condition. So guys, that is the top 20-ish green cards for the Game of Force of Will in the Wanderer format, from Grim Cluster all the way up until now. This is basically your buy list for green going into the Wanderer format. So let us know what you guys think down in the comment section down below. Are there cards you would like to see other places? Are there cards that I didn't put on the list that you would like to see? If you like this kind of content, hit that like button, hit subscribe, and ring that bell. And until next time, guys, on the Yearbook, this has been Paul. I'll catch you later.